Order, order. The committee is now in session. The Science and Technology Committee is continuing its long-standing scrutiny of the work of the Biometrics Commissioner and the Forensic Science Regulator, following on work that the previous committee in previous parliaments, in fact, undertook in May 2018 and July 2019. We published reports. The government responded to the most recent report, our report of July 2019, in March of this year. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to begin by taking evidence from the two people who until a few months ago were the Forensic Science Regulator and the Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometric Material. Then we'll hear from the two current government ministers and one of their Home Office officials. So, for our first panel of witnesses, I'm very pleased to welcome and to introduce Professor Gillian Tully. Professor Tully is Professor of the Practice of Forensic Science Policy and Regulation at King's College London. And from 2014 to February of this year, she was the Forensic Science Regulator for England and Wales. And Professor Paul Wiles. Professor Wiles is a Governor of Sheffield Hallam University, and from 2016 to last December was the Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometric Material. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for the work that you've done in this area and for giving evidence to the committee today. I'd like to start on forensic science, if I may, and perhaps ask Professor Tully just to summarise the main issues now currently facing forensic science in England and Wales.
Okay, I think there are a number of immediate issues and then there are some more strategic issues, so I will be brief. I think one of the immediate issues is making sure that we have the sustainable capacity to meet the needs of the whole criminal justice system, and there is still insufficient capacity in some areas of forensic science. Most notably digital forensics and toxicology, but there are an increasing number of services that were mainstream but are becoming more and more niche and need some level of protection. So some of the more traditional chemistry and marks and traces disciplines fall into that remit. I think the second issue is in some ways related, and that's the inability of some organisations to meet the required quality standards. And the more organisations are under pressure in terms of delivery, the more difficult it is for them to invest the time and effort in putting in place that systematic quality management that helps to drive improvement. Other organisations have been fully compliant for many years, so it's not that these standards are unachievable, but it has been difficult, and some organisations, as I say, are still far from there. And even once you have the quality standards, you need to build on them and continue to improve and to really develop that scientific culture and continuous professional development and ongoing learning and improvement. If we then think about why we've reached that, perhaps one of the issues that strikes me is that we don't yet have a clear, balanced and effective national decision-making structure in relation to forensic science. So there is a criminal justice, this Criminal Justice Board has a forensic science subgroup, and the people who sit around the table on a quarterly basis have all the best intentions to improve matters, but largely they are not in control of the decision makers who spend the money and who make the decision on where that money goes, because mainly the decisions are made by chief officers of police and police and crime commissioners or their mayoral equivalents. They're the ones with the budgets. So although there is good intent, I don't think yet we have brought about a situation where there can be a policy decided and then implemented on a national basis, because the decision making is still very devolved. And that is understandable because of the the operational independence of chief officers, but it is an issue when you're trying to create and build national infrastructure and make sure that it serves the whole criminal justice service, whole criminal justice system, and not just one part of that. And then the final area that I'll highlight to start with really is that there's no clear way forward for a balanced research portfolio to meet the needs of the whole criminal justice system again. So not just the short-term needs of policing or the short or medium-term needs of one other part of the system, but a really balanced long and short-term portfolio of properly funded research.
Thank you. Well, that's a very good agenda for us to delve into during our session this morning. Perhaps just a few follow-ups on that. So you talk about having the sustainable capacity and that there are some areas in which that is insufficient. You mentioned digital forensics and toxicology. Now, there are two words together there, sustainable capacity. What about current capacity? In other words, the needs of the current criminal justice system. Are there any areas in which the forensic services are not up to meeting the current demand?
Well, certainly at the point when I left my role as regulator, neither toxicology nor digital forensics had sufficient capacity to meet the current needs of the service.
And what is the consequence of that then?
In toxicology, there were a few cases at least that had to be abandoned because they passed their statutory time limit. So that's road traffic toxicology type cases, so they weren't getting processed on time to get to court. And that's even with a level of rationing of the service amongst different police forces, so how many samples they could submit on a regular basis.
Just on that's testing for alcohol or drugs in the...
It's drugs in blood from driving offences, yes.
I see. So some of those cases where, by implication, the case rests on the accusation that someone might be driving under the influence of drugs, they are having to be dropped because there isn't this capacity.
Yes, it has been, as far as I know, at the point when I left, it was a relatively small number of cases that had to be discontinued because of the custody time limit issue. But there was also this issue of each police force only having a certain capacity that they could call on. So they were having to internally decide how to use that capacity, and they would decide that on the basis of threat, risk and harm and the way they prioritise other issues, but there is definitely a shortfall there, or there was at the point.
So just on that, do you have a view or a recollection of how many cases explicitly were dropped because they'd reached the time limit because the capacity wasn't available?
It was only a few at that point.
A few being?
Less than 10 at that point,
right.
Yes.
But am I reading correctly into the implication of what you said, that perhaps knowing that there is not sufficient capacity, some cases don't proceed to that point because there's a prioritisation?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Thank you. So that was toxicology. On digital forensics, would you just give us a feel for what the consequences of the lack of capacity there is, or the shortage?
Primarily delays. There are mobile devices and computers sitting in very long queues for analysis, and that's one of the biggest issues. And it's a very difficult issue because even staying still, the demand will continue to grow and double year on year probably. So I think there is a lot to do around being very careful about what the case strategy is. So what do investigators really want from these devices? What is required for court purposes, and to allow the defence to have adequate access and so on, and creating a proper balance with really well thought through requirements is part of the answer, because we can't just keep building more and more, I think, as the amount of data on devices grows. But at the same time, I think people have been under pressure in this field for a very, very long time, and it does need further investment and further automation, some of which is at least planned.
And is this area subject to the same consequences as in toxicology? In other words, time limits requiring cases to be dropped on the basis of capacity rather than a kind of prosecutor's judgment?
No, this one is more to do with prosecutor's judgment. The statutory time limit is for the magistrates' court cases. So this is, but the implications can be, and certainly the Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate in their most recent report indicated that they felt that some victims were withdrawing from supporting cases because it was taking so long to get to court. So, there are significant implications.
I see, thank you. Let me, before I turn to my colleague Graham Stringer, let me just ask you about one of the second thing that you said, which was the inability of some organisations to meet the quality standards that you mentioned. Does that include the police laboratories?
Yes.
Right. And when you say the inability to meet the standards, is that merely a process thing that they haven't been through the accreditation procedure and therefore literally haven't met the standard, or should we be concerned that in terms of the actual standards that they are meeting, in other words, the quality of the work, that is deficient, that's substandard?
Well, I think the process of accreditation is the way that we look to see, with a third-party eye, have you met the standards? It doesn't look at everything, and it's not infallible, but it tries to take a snapshot of, is this organisation meeting the standards? Does it have the systematic processes, the oversight, the leadership that it needs in order to be able to be sustainably good quality? And so far, we have found that a number of police organisations in particular have come forward for accreditation, and you should only come forward when you believe you are fully compliant. And a number have failed to then achieve that accreditation at that point. Now, it is a learning process. They are new to some elements of this, and some areas it is quite new application of the standards, so particularly around crime scene analysis. But on the other hand, some organisations have held that accreditation for many years. So in crime scene investigations so far, only one police force has one site accredited thus far. The timeline for them to achieve all sites for all forces is October 2022 from memory, and that's been put back because of the delays with COVID. But it seems frankly impossible that they'll reach that target from where they are now. So I'd say it's a bit of both. I'd say that we haven't yet managed to embed those quality systems fully to a sufficient extent in those organisations for them to be able to get the accreditation that they need. And as I say, that is really just the start of quality. Quality goes beyond that. Quality is about our scientific approach to everything, but it does look at things like staff competence, equipment, are the methods scientifically valid, and those important underpinning elements of quality.
Indeed, and I think everyone would recognise that the meeting standards and demonstrating the effectiveness of systems is important, but so is the actual quality of the work. And I dare say it might be said that perhaps in the police-run laboratories, that the culture and the inherited way of working is such that they can operate at a high level of quality, even if they haven't, as it were, passed the accreditation. Would that be fair, or are you concerned that not only is there a lack of accreditation, but actually there are deficiencies in the practice?
I think it's fair to say that I am concerned that there are some deficiencies, because you need to be able to demonstrate that you can avoid contamination, for example, as far as possible. You'll never eliminate it completely. And so that means you need to be able to trace back, are your swabs of the right standard? Are your vans appropriately equipped when you go to a crime scene? Do you know that you're not carrying DNA from one crime scene to another on the stepping plates that you use? Yeah. And those are the sorts of things that are looked at in this process. And if you can't demonstrate that, then it must necessarily raise a concern.
Looking at it from the other way, are you aware of instances in which there has been cross-contamination, not just in prospect, but in practice?
Yes. There are a significant number of instances where the DNA profiles of police staff in particular, police officers, also have been left on evidential items, and that's why we have a contamination elimination database to help us find those things, and that's a good part of our mitigation for those risks. But ultimately, if you do leave your own DNA all over something, then you're not going to find the evidential material that may be hidden underneath that.
So the consequence of that is that convictions that might otherwise be made if there were greater integrity to the process would be lost, or convictions might be unsafe. Would that which of those?
I think it's much more likely to be the former with contamination. You're unlikely to convict somebody incorrectly on the basis of contamination, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. And quite some time ago, there was a contamination incident. It was in fact before my time as regulator, but that resulted in someone spending some months in prison before it was discovered. So it's not impossible, but it's more likely that you compromise evidence that could have been used effectively.
Thank you. That's very clear. And finally, from me, before I turn to Graham, you mentioned about the subgroup not having, as it were, the bite on decision making, a different set of people. What's the solution to that? Is it to have the decision makers as part of the group rather than being separate from it?
It's a really difficult question, because the fundamental issue is that the main decision makers, there are 86 of them, with 43 police forces, each with a chief officer and a police authority. So that's a really difficult decision, and I think it's something that needs to be thought about very carefully. Should this be an area where each police force is just completely free to make their own decisions, or should there be actually a national decision-making process in relation to policy issues of forensic science? And the government has put in place the Transforming Forensics Programme and the Forensic Capability Network to try and get police forces to work together, but they are also trying to work through persuasion rather than through any form of mandate. So it really depends on whether there is an appetite to mandate national decision making, and in my experience there doesn't appear to be such a mandate or such an appetite.
So given your experience, nearly 7 years of experience in the role, is it your view that you need to have a mandatory decision-making system, and that the persuasion has kind of run its course, or could that be given further time to attempt it, for it to work?
I think there are some issues on which really there should be national decision making, and one of those is around these areas where we have insufficient capacity, for example. So there needs to be a way to stimulate increases in capacity. So toxicology, for example, is provided by the external forensic market. And if there is no clear view for that external market on what individual forces are going to do, then it's very difficult for them in making investment decisions. And some of them have done so, and have done so at risk to themselves. But it's a difficult argument to make if you don't know what the future likes, and you see one force deciding that it's going to create its own toxicology laboratory, and it recruits a few scientists out of your lab to do so, and that makes it difficult for people to plan for the future. So I think there are some areas in which, we ought to think, are there some areas here that are a matter of infrastructure for the criminal justice system that we need to actually say, on these areas we need a national approach, and we need everyone to fall in line with that national approach.
I see. Thank you very much indeed. Graham Stringer.
Professor Tully, thank you for coming to the committee again. I won't ask you the same question I've asked you virtually every other time. You've been to the committee. I've just checked. You first came to the committee in March 2011, after the government had announced in the previous December their plans to close the Forensic Science Service. Can you tell us what is better now about the Forensic Science Service and what is worse over that sort of 10-year period?
I think it's very difficult for me as a single person to answer that question, because there are as many perspectives on the answer as there are people.
You've been in an almost unique position, haven't you?
I have, but I was also a member of staff at the Forensic Science Service, so it's difficult for me to be even seen as completely independent on that question. Prices fell, but they fell too far, and then the market had to be rescued by putting additional money into all the contracts, and that was an actual issue that was looked at through forensic accounting. They had actually become unsustainable. So that's something that happened and came about. There is more competition. There is perhaps less of a dominant supplier, although one of the suppliers is substantially bigger than others. But again, is just working on competition always effective? It's hard to say. I think that all the smaller organisations and the academic institutions would generally say it's better that more money is not all concentrated in one place. I think the downside of that is you get very fragmented investment, and so rather than looking at a few organisations working very hard to improve their quality and so on, you're looking at many organisations trying to do that, and that's probably more expensive for them to achieve. And similarly on research, there was always a view that all the government money was going to the Forensic Science Service, and therefore other institutions were missing out. Actually, it was the Forensic Science Service investing its own returns in latter years anyway on research, and that money was lost. It wasn't then taken and given to anyone else to do research, so there was money lost from that environment. Doesn't mean we can build up research again. I think it needs to be with a strong focus on collaboration, though, to build that real body of expertise.
When we first spoke to you, one of your concerns was that while DNA, fingerprints, other tests might be done at less cost or more efficiently, that there would be a loss of advice on the context, so that you were providing police with advice on what questions they should ask, given the context of any crime. Has that been borne out in reality? Has there been a loss of that advice?
Again, it varies very much around the country. So some of the police forces and police force areas have entered into contracts that are very much around working with their forensic science provider to give them that advice and context and so on. Others have been much more transactional in their contracting, and I have seen forms submitted to forensic science providers where the questions to answer section is not populated by questions to answer for the scientist to think about, but it's populated by, I'll have 3 of this test and 2 of that one, and that's not a good approach in my opinion. So again, it has varied around the country. I think The larger forensic science providers have got that capacity to provide those services and very much want to do that. And in some of their contracts, they're very much able to do that, and in others, much less so.
Thanks. And just finally, on going over previous concerns, this committee was concerned over a long period about both access to and the integrity of the archive. What has happened to the archive? What state is it in now?
So, well, my latest information dates back to February, but the archive was still running and operated as part of a shell company that still had the same company name as the Forensic Science Service. It was intended, at the last triennial review, it was intended that it would only serve that fixed set of assets that it had at the time the Forensic Science Service closed. So it isn't taking lots of new stuff from all around the place. So it's anything since the Forensic Science Service closed wasn't supposed to go to the archive. There have been a couple of instances where the archive has been used as almost emergency housing for material when a provider has gone into administration or left the market. So that has happened on a couple of instances.
So the worries about its integrity and decaying, not being kept properly, were unfounded, were they, in reality?
Well, the retention of the stuff that was already in the archive has been done properly, yes.
Can I just come back to your position as regulator, or previous position as regulator? The government has held the view that a statutory power to demand laboratory accreditation would detract from the independence of the regulator. Do you agree with that? And why do you think the government are saying that?
So there is now the Forensic Science Regulator Act, which is passed and been given royal assent, and it gives the new regulator, when it comes into force, it will give the new regulator powers to intervene when there is a substantial risk to the CJS. And I do think that is going to be an appropriate way to move forward, because that enables the forensic science regulator to act when an organisation is accredited or unaccredited if they perceive there to be a significant risk. So I'm not particularly concerned that the legislation is framed in that way as opposed to around mandatory accreditation. I don't think it's an issue of independence of the regulator, though. I thought that was a...
Right. How did the government respond to your repeated alerts that police laboratories would miss your deadlines for accreditation?
Sorry, could you repeat the beginning of that?
How did the government respond to your repeated alerts that police laboratories would miss your deadlines for accreditation?
Well, there were one or two letters written by ministers to chief constables reminding them of the requirements. And I think the other thing they would say is they set up Transforming Forensics and the Forensic Capability Network. But in reality, those deadlines have continued to be missed over a sustained period.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Tully, I just wanted to pick up very quickly off the back of that and ask you, what impacts does the lack of mandatory accreditation have on the stability of the forensics market?
So, I would say it's not so much the impact of mandatory accreditation as statutory powers more generally to ensure people are providing work of the right quality. I think one of the issues there, perhaps, is that there was no sanction if an organisation decided to use its unaccredited facility versus using an accredited organisation. So the best example that I can give is of a small digital forensics provider that had invested in getting the appropriate accreditation, but not long before the point when I left office, it was considering withdrawing from the market because it wasn't getting enough work from the police forces, who were using their own in-house facilities that had less of the appropriate accreditation.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll now turn to biometrics, and perhaps I can ask my colleague Catherine Fletcher to ask some questions of Professor Wiles.
Well, good morning all. Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for your time, both. It's appreciated. Professor Wiles, I wasn't part of the previous inquiry in previous parliaments, but I want to kind of look to the future because it's an important area. So, do you have a view of what the current issues are facing kind of biometrics moving forward?
Yes. Let me start off with the police use of biometrics, but then I'll go beyond the police use of biometrics. I think the first thing is that the framework of governance for the police use of biometrics simply has not kept up with the development of new biometrics. Nor has the government responded to judgments by both domestic courts and the European Courts of Human Rights about the inadequacy of that current framework. And some of those judgments go back almost 9 years now. Secondly, there's been a lack by either the police or the Home Office altogether to develop a proper based evidence base about the use of the new biometrics. At some point, the police and the Home Office together are going to have to decide which of the range of biometrics which will exist in the future actually it makes sense to deploy, and what the relative cost benefits of different combinations of those biometrics are. That knowledge base doesn't exist, and there's been no investment in creating that knowledge base. The third thing has been the continuing failure of the Home Office to update the crucial databases that hold both biometric data and the general information about offenders, convictions, arrests, and so on, because some of the databases that are still being used actually go back to 1974 when they were put in place. This is technology from the middle of the last century. Fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, there's been a failure by the Home Office to grasp the strategic significance of these new technologies. The biometrics, together with artificial intelligence, together with large databases, are the technologies, at least in part, that will drive the future social world in which we live. And therefore, this isn't just a sort of small technical problem about policing, it's a strategic question for the UK government, and nor is it just a matter for the Home Office. We've seen how some other countries, the most obvious example, almost infamous example, of course, is China, that has recognized the strategic importance of these technologies, is becoming a world leader in these technologies, and of course is exporting those technologies. But it's not just a valueless technology it's exporting, it's something rather more than that. So this is very much part of the growth of China and the growth of China transplant influence. But China is just one example.
Professor Wiles, I'm very conscious that I want that to be grounded for people accessing this. So could you perhaps give us an example of the type of scenario you're talking about?
Okay, which one do you want me to talk to? The failure of governance?
No, the idea. So someone takes a snap of you on the CCTV camera on the street. Just kind of ground that into what that would mean for a lad or lass on the road in terms of where the law is in error and as you see it.
Well, currently we have a general legal framework which is overseen by the Information Commissioner's Office, and you'll have seen in your evidence the report from the Information Commissioner's Office. That provides a general framework which the Commissioner can intervene if people breach the general data requirements. So there is one legal framework.
So if someone takes a snap of me on CCTV on the road, I want to just run it through. So a breach would be the council sharing that picture elsewhere, and the current law can regulate for that?
It may be. It depends on the particular circumstances and the reasons why they share it. That will be a judgment for the Information Commissioner. I think what I'm more concerned about are two things. First of all, it's not just the CCTV cameras. Hardly any of us do not have a photograph somewhere online. If you've been to a birthday party and somebody's taken a photograph of the celebration, if you've been out for a meal for a celebration and somebody's taken a photograph, your photograph's online. That can be searched through the web and can be matched to identify who you are. This is a very pervasive technology. But the real question is not that this technology may not be in the public interest. Certain uses, I have no doubt, will be in the public interest. The question is which of the uses are in the public interest and who decides what's in the public interest and what is very definitely not in the public interest. At the moment, there is a framework that allows the Information Commissioner to express an opinion. But when it comes to the old biometrics, DNA and fingerprints, it was you, Parliament, that made that decision through legislation. And that's what I'm pointing to, that lack of a legislative framework, so that everybody's clear what is in the public interest and therefore acceptable, and what is not in the public interest and therefore is not acceptable.
That's incredibly helpful. So what would you, I'm asking you to speculate slightly, but what would you like to see in that law? What changes do we need to make and bring forward?
Well, I very carefully as Commissioner, and I will continue, not to say what I think Parliament should decide is in the public interest. That's a matter for you elected representatives. I do not have that kind of legitimacy. But what I do think is that Parliament should make the decision. How should these biometrics be used? How can you frame a law that will actually provide a governance framework for a technology which is rapidly changing all the time? That is quite a difficult legislative problem that I think Parliament has to grapple with. I mean, initially ministers, but then Parliament.
Yeah, understood. And it's not just facial recognition, is it? It's the fingerprints that we're using on our phone to access our bank accounts. Yes. It's quite the range, isn't there? Are there any more that you would put on the radar?
Voice recognition is already on that radar. Some elements of law enforcement are already using voice recognition. As you know, banks are using it for identification. So that is increasingly widely used. You'll have seen from the Information Commissioner's report that facial images are being used by right across the private and public sector for different uses. Gait analysis is another one I'd put on there. How we walk, which allows us to identify people. This is a bundle of technologies, and you have to put it alongside artificial intelligence, which means databases that don't even include biometrics can be linked to biometric identification. If you shop at a supermarket, like all of us, that supermarket knows an awful lot about you and your behaviour, simply from your shopping patterns.
It's very interesting. I'm conscious my colleague Rebecca Long-Bailey wants to come in, so I will say thank you very much there, and maybe look forward to pursuing this further in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Very broad question to start. In the recent legal case of Bridges versus South Wales Police, the Court of Appeal ruled that the police's use of automatic facial recognition was unlawful because the police automatically and without consent collected and processed the biometric data of members of the public, violating their right to privacy under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So what, in your view, are the key elements of a legal framework where facial recognition can be used without consent that does not violate fundamental human rights? And I'll put that firstly to Professor Wiles.
All right, if I could, as you've done, refer back to the South Wales case and the appeal court judgment. The appeal court, as I'm sure you're aware because you're a lawyer, were very clear on the grounds on which it was unlawful. And one of the main things they drew attention to was that the police hadn't done enough to satisfy themselves that there wasn't discrimination in the use of that technology. and whether the particular algorithms that they were using had biases built into them, not helped by the fact that the vendors refused to disclose what they knew about biases. But the main point the court was making is that the police had to make sure whether there was bias in the algorithms they were using for facial matching, and had to take steps then, if there was bias, in order to how they were going to make sure that didn't unlawfully discriminate. So that's the first thing, that any use of facial technology, the police have to understand whether there are biases and whether those biases can be satisfactorily corrected in the way they use the technology. And I think there's a serious question about vendors who will not reveal what they know about bias, because that makes it almost impossible for the police to do that. So I think we'll see in any future attempted use by the police of live facial recognition that there's significant work put in to addressing that question. As regards Article 8 is concerned, I think what the police are hoping in a way is that as long as, if they get a match and it's not from their point of view a relevant match, i.e. it doesn't match with somebody on their watch list, then they automatically delete that profile. And they have to be able to show they're doing that, and they have to evidence that they're doing that. I think the third thing, which, as you know, the appeal court pointed to, was how the watch lists were drawn up. Who was on these watch lists? How were they chosen? And was that watch list therefore acceptable and didn't violate Article 8? If those watch lists are made of people that are on a wanted list for a serious crime, then I suspect there will not be an issue with that. If, on the other hand, it's a general trawl of a broader nature, then I think there will be questions. And I think the police have got to work on that. Now, I know that the Home Office, together with the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing, is working on drawing up guidelines, and I understand it's done so, but they haven't been published. We'll have to see when they publish them whether we think they meet those tests that you've pointed to.
Thank you very much, Professor Wiles. We've temporarily lost the connection to Rebecca Long-Bailey, but I'm sure we'll be able to get it back. Just to go back to something that Catherine Fletcher was asking about, you very clearly said, and very appropriately, that it's a decision for Parliament as to what should be in the public interest and what should not be in the public interest when it comes to the use of this technology. But in order for Parliament to be exercised about it, sometimes it is particular issues that draw attention to a prospective injustice. So can you help us with what types of things? What would you consider, from your experience and your knowledge, what would you think would be so against the public interest that it would require Parliament to step in and regulate?
Well, first of all, let me make the obvious point that public interest in this issue developed very rapidly with the two uses of live facial recognition by South Wales Police and the Metropolitan Police. There was clearly a public concern about that, and a public concern that they were surprised that there wasn't already a clear legal framework around the use of facial images in this way. So I think that was a galvanizing event in terms of raising this question in a different way. As to the improper use of live facial recognition, I mean, it will be possible in the future to use live facial recognition purely for a private, commercial, profit motive interest, without necessarily making the individual aware that that is going on. This is simply the analogue of what we're already seeing in the use made of the data that every day all of us give, not just to big tech companies, but to small companies as well, and the fact that they are exploiting that and selling that data on without us really understanding. Now, of course, I'm aware that every time any of us go on a website, we're asked whether we approve. I doubt many people actually read through 2 or 3 pages of detailed and decide whether they don't want to. They just click the yes button and go on. So we've already got this problem in the collection of other data, but that problem will now begin to emerge in relation to facial recognition, because more and more companies are able to collect facial data. I mean, to show you how amusing this can be, I can remember going to the Today programme, going to the BBC, being asked by the interviewer, how dare these people collect facial images? And I said, well, when I arrived at the BBC this morning, they pulled up my photograph from the last time I was in the BBC, which you have kept. You didn't ask me whether you could keep it, you've just kept it. So this is a very pervasive technology. And then there are cases that are really quite interesting, potentially in the public interest, but need discussion. For example, the idea of a frictionless airport, that we arrive at the front entrance to an airport from our photograph on our passport, the camera recognises, lets us in, and it continues stages to confirm our identity up to the point when we get on a plane. None of those endless barriers, checks, and all the things we've got now, which, if you're like me, you hate going through airports doing all of that. That may well be seen as in the public interest to produce a much more efficient work through the airport. But there have to be clear rules about what can be done with those images, what can they be used for. And we've seen how tricky this is with the recent fact that the former Secretary of State for Health had to put back the NHS database that he wished everybody to be part of. Because whilst people were very happy with the idea of our NHS data being used for medical research for our benefit, they weren't convinced that that was all it was going to be used for. And they wanted clarity on that. So this is an issue that isn't just about policing. It isn't just about the Home Office. The whole of government is going to have to address this one.
Thank you. I think Catherine wanted to come back in. Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. And I just want to bring a little bit more colour to this, just so we can start having the debate. So there's quite a... I started my career in technology, and one of the old anecdotes is the people using the club card for one of the major supermarkets, and being able to tell the marketing department exactly more about any given customer based on the data that you get for your points. And that's an accepted technology, and some people like me choose not to have those because we don't want to share the data, but it's relatively well understood. But the implications of what you're saying is the commercial application of security cameras within a large store can tell how long I dwell on 2 different types of beans because they're following me with my face. They are then tying that to which one I actually purchased, and then have an ability to influence my commercial behaviour off the back of a stonking great big database, the computer AI automatically recognising my face, and no human need become involved. Do we have any legal framework to prevent that at the moment?
We have we have, as I said to you before, we have the Information Commissioner and the legislation which she is responsible for. In that particular case, if the Information Commissioner examined that process and felt that it was in line with data protection legislation, then that's the end of the matter. There is no legislation other than that I'm aware of that would prevent that. And such uses in the way you've described it, I'm sure most shoppers are aware of. I'm sure, like me, when I go to the supermarket, I often find I am being offered online on my phone things that they know I tend to buy, or that they've got on offer that week that they know I tend to buy. I don't find that in itself a particular problem. What I want to know is there anything else being done with my information? Is it being passed to third parties? And if so, for what? And with what controls? So it's not just...
And is the data server in a state that might not be as welcoming of the... But just another... It's a really interesting question. One more follow-up, if I may, Chair. You mentioned the database being from the 70s. Fabulous decade. Certain things emerged on the planet. But people will concede that I've got a few wrinkles these days. So what is that database? What's it coded in? Is it Fortran or something?
Yes.
Oh.
It's the Police National Computer. Police National Computer was created in '74. It was updated late '90s. But the problem is it's on a life support machine, essentially. Very few people actually know how to modify the thing.
Oh yeah.
And the Home Office have been promising to replace PNC with a new IT system. It's crucial because that is, as it were, the knowledge-based policing. It contains the biographical details of arrestees, whether they were charged, whether they were convicted, if so, what, and what their sentence was, and everything else. And all the biometric databases, DNA, fingerprints, facial images, they don't contain that information. They hang off PNC. So until they get a replacement for PNC, these new biometric databases that they've been developing really won't be able to be used properly. Now, supposedly, the PNC replacement was coming in now. From what I've seen, and you must remember I left office over 6 months ago, but from what I saw up to that point, they've gone back to the beginning again. I mean, the PNC replacement, I suspect, is years away. And there's not only does that prevent a coherent framework for knowledge within policing, but there's a real danger that it will actually collapse at some point.
Yeah, it does have the ancillary benefit for those of us concerned with technology to know that, Big Brother in terms of the PNC is not capable of watching it. Yeah, your point's well made. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Catherine. Go to Erin Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for coming in. I'll continue on with Professor Wiles, if I may. Just on the automatic facial recognition, you made the point earlier that people click the accept cookies button and that's consent, but is it really meaningful, and are people actually reading what they're consenting to? I mean, isn't the risk basically that whenever you go into a public place with cameras or anything else now, you're essentially leaving cookies, in the real world, and yep. What on earth does consent look like for that? Do we need to just put up notices saying you may be recorded and you may be profiled, or is that where we have to draw a new law that says you can't do these things?
Well, I think we want a better legal framework. Whether that legislation says you can't do those things is, as I kept saying, a question for Parliament. I certainly think that a lot of the current processes by which technology companies are claiming consent are inadequate for just the reasons that you've given. But it's not just the consent for the immediate situation, but it's the link between that and other areas. If I can give you a specific example, the area around King's Cross Station, the new development around King's Cross St Pancras, whilst you might think that's public space, it's actually private space. And it contains a lot of CCTV cameras. So as soon as you walk into that retail and restaurant area between King's Cross and St Pancras, you are being monitored on cameras, and your face is being looked at. What then emerged, however, was that the police had given to the owners of that private space information from the Police National Database about photographs taken of arrestees. Now, it's that link, I think, that needs to be looked at carefully. So, as I said in response to the previous questioner, there's a question of the immediate use, and then there's the question of then what happens to that data? Is it shared with someone else? If so, what for? And I think the question of sharing data is one of the issues that Parliament has to grapple with.
Thank you. That brings me actually quite nicely onto the questions I wanted to ask you about custody images, because I know you've spoken about this a number of times in the past. Is there a clear set of national protocols governing the management of custody images, in your opinion?
There is what is called MOPI guidance, Management of Police Information Systems, which covers facial images as well as other information that the police hold. What, however, you need to understand is that MOPI gives complete discretion to chief officers, so that people can apply to have their information deleted, including facial images, including DNA, including fingerprints. But whether that happens is entirely at the discretion of the chief officer. Now, that has an important implication, which is you cannot automate any deletion rules for facial images. You could only automate a discretionary system, I suppose, if you developed an AI system that exercised the discretion. But I doubt we'd be happy with that. Whereas for fingerprints and DNA, there are clear rules within the Protection of Freedoms Act about when DNA and fingerprints must be deleted, and therefore that system is automated.
And so would you recommend that we align the custody images with what we do for fingerprints and DNA then?
I have suggested that to the Home Office in the past because it would be the most obvious. I mean, the most obvious thing to do would just have been to extend the Protection of Freedom Act to facial images, or to any other new biometric, as far as retention is concerned. Both the Home Office and the Police Service have always run the argument that facial images are different, and they've come up with various reasons as to why they think images are different. The main one of which is that it's mainly used for intelligence purposes, rather than for prosecution or conviction. I find that a very curious argument because it seems to me just as important that the intelligence the police hold should be regulated in the same way as the information that the biometrics that they hold in relation to whether somebody has been charged or convicted or not. I don't personally find that a very convincing answer. But that would certainly be one way to deal with the question.
And is that why you've said in the past that you think the proposals from the Custody Image Review in 2017 might not withstand court challenge for that same reason? You're not convinced that they would necessarily be found lawful?
It's not just whether I think that, but a European Court of Human Rights judgment called the CAT judgment.
Yep.
And it's a very brief paragraph, so I'll read it to you. Accordingly, the court is not convinced that deletion of the data would be so burdensome as to render it unreasonable. In general terms, the court would add that it would be entirely contrary to the need to protect private life under Article 8 if the government could create a database in such a manner that the data in it could not be easily reviewed or edited, and then use this development as a justification to refuse to remove the information from that database. So there is now a judgment. That CAT judgment was in 2019, about which is speaking about the MOPI guidance in general.
I mean, you've been critical, obviously, of the Home Office's failure to update databases, which we've spoken about already, and Catherine Fletcher asked you about that 1974 Police National Computer. Is that what these custody images are stored on? Is that the same system?
No. The custody images are stored on a different database called the Police National Database, which was set up after the Shoham Macquarie murders. And that holds the facial images. But there have been two development programs in the Home Office. One is the Biometrics program, which has been developing new databases for DNA, fingerprints, facial images, and potentially could then extend to a new database for voice as well, if that was wanted. But the crucial thing, as I was explaining earlier on, is those databases do not store the biographical or criminal justice records of the individuals. That's in PNC. And therefore, those databases have to link. The problem with facial images, apart from the fact, as I say, you need clear rules if you're going to automate deletion, is that PND doesn't link to PNC. That's the missing link. The intention was to have a new facial images database that would link to the replacement for PNC. That's the plan.
When it does link, does that not make the custody images issue a bigger issue?
In what sense?
In that once we have a proper link between the databases and you can start running, lots more searches and algorithms on that, the fact that you've got these custody images there that people have to currently manually request to be deleted, or they'll get deleted after 6 years, is that not going to become a bigger problem at that stage when you've got people who've never been charged? Well, if what you're saying that facial images become more important, yes, you're right. And it's not just the databases. I mean, facial images in many ways is the easiest from a technical point of view, means of identification available to the police. It's easier than fingerprints. You don't have to put somebody's fingerprint on a reader. It's much easier than DNA. You don't have to send it off to a laboratory.
So this is the easiest identification technology, and for that reason, I think will be a very important technology in the future. Indeed, I think there's going to be a question whether it will replace fingerprints.
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of direction of travel. The problem, once you've got the databases easily linked, is you could then have automatic deletion, providing you had non-discretionary rules about retention and deletion.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Just to follow up on a point that you raised, Professor Wiles. So you suggested, I think, or kind of raised the thought that DNA and fingerprint rules could be aligned with facial images. Isn't the difference this, that DNA and fingerprints are used ex post a potential crime, whereas facial images their use is live, and we have experienced, sadly in recent years, of marauding attacks in which that live use is categorically different from the kind of the forensics associated with a crime that's been committed. Therefore, isn't that why it is a separate category and does need to be considered differently?
Yes, except that there are developments such that fingerprints can be read remotely in certain circumstances now as well. So that variation between post-use and forward use, live use of a technology, may not be one that is clear in the future across all the biometrics. Voice and gait can be used in that kind of way as well. So you're right, there is a difference, and new legislation is going to have to work out how to deal with that. All I'd say is this isn't unique to face matching. It applies to some of the other new biometrics as well, and may even in future relate to some of the existing biometrics.
So, for example, a kind of fingerprint that is used to access a bank account could be used for a live fraud, as it were. Is that what you have in mind?
That is certainly true, but also more to the point is that there are technologies emerging that will allow you to read fingerprints from a distance, as it were.
Right, I see. Thank you for that. Just to go back to Professor Tully finally, Professor Wiles has set out a recommendation that Parliament really should consider how it wants to regulate the use of biometric data in the future, and that some of these questions are for Parliament, especially with the emerging technology. Going back to the evidence that you've given to us today and the evidence that you've given to the committee in the past, what is your recommendation for next steps? What should the government be doing, and what should Parliament be doing to address the concerns that you've highlighted today?
Well, I think Parliament has done its job. It's now passed the Forensic Science Regulator Act, and I'm extremely grateful to Darren Jones for introducing that. In terms of government, I think it is grappling with that question about how decisions are going to be made is the really key one, because once that's made, then all the other day-to-day problems can be addressed more easily. But it's just very difficult when you have to get 86 people to agree to anything.
Thank you. And on the accreditation point, what should be done to solve the problem that you've identified today?
Well, really, that sits with the new Forensic Science Regulator, who will be able to exercise his statutory powers and, where necessary, issue compliance notices that will require organisations potentially to cease operations until they have that necessary accreditation in place. So he will be able to exercise his judgment on that.
So it's a question in that respect of implementing
yes.
Powers. Can I thank both witnesses? That is very authoritative, indeed expert evidence. We're very grateful for the time that you've given in your very important public service roles and for the evidence you've given to the committee today. We will suspend the hearing just for a few minutes, a couple of minutes, while we rearrange the next panel of witnesses and invite them to join us. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order. The committee is back in session, and I'm very pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses, and they are two Ministers of State at the Home Office, Baroness Williams, who is the Minister responsible for forensic science and DNA, and Kit Malthouse MP, who as Policing Minister is responsible for police technology, including facial recognition, and they're joined by Dr. Christoph Prinz, who is the Director of Data and Identity at the Home Office. You may have caught some of our earlier proceedings, and these are very important matters in the public interest that we're grappling with. Our predecessor committee in the last Parliament produced a report on some of these matters that are evolving. It took 20 months to respond. I don't know whether Baroness Williams, you understand why that was the case?
You were looking at me in the eye, Chairman, so I knew you'd come to me first. But first of all, apologies to the committee. It is a long time to have to wait for a report. we did actually have a draft response ready, and then the general election of 2019 happened. But that's, I guess that's not a great reason to not have produced the response. But we haven't been idle since then, and actually some quite helpful things have happened since then. And the first, which has been referred to this morning, is the clarification of the legal position in regards to LFR, live facial recognition, in the appeal to the Judge Bridges case. So we now have clarification around that. We now have the forensic science regulator on a statutory footing, which I think is a very good thing. And we've worked with the police on producing national guidance on the use of LFR, and I think that's very important going forward in terms of public confidence and trust. And to that end, the College of Policing has just finished consulting on it, so that national guidance should be very important going forward. We've also simplified the oversight arrangements, so we now have a biometrics commissioner and surveillance camera commissioner as one position, which takes over two part-time roles. So one of the things that we've always been clear about is simplification of the landscape, and I think that goes towards achieving those ends.
Thank you very much for that. So you said that there was a draft response ready to come out in 2019. Yep. We got the response in 2021. I think it was in March we had the response. Has it changed much from the draft of 2019?
So I think what has changed is the Bridges appeal clarification. What has also changed is the forensic science regulator. The FSR bill is now an act, and I think the simplification of the landscape has changed. So practical things have changed since the drafting of those of the response, which at that stage would have been an aspiration as opposed to a concrete result.
I see. Well, we'll go into some more detail in some of the subjects, but is it your joint view that these issues are matters of importance to the Home Office and to the government?
Well, they're not just matters of importance to the Home Office, they're matters of importance to the general public, because it is within these things that we're talking about that you will get justice or otherwise for people accused of committing crimes.
Mr. Malthouse?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I add my apologies for the delay. As Susan said, various events occurred which delayed things. We are very sorry. But from our point of view, speaking with my kind of policing hat on, both of these biometrics and forensics are completely critical to the future success and indeed consent model of the police. I mean, I listened to some of the evidence from your previous witnesses, and I think it's hard to disentangle the two. Because as technology pervades our lives more and more, we need to be sure that both the police can access that technology and use it to get better and better at what they do, primarily prevent crime as well as detect it, but also that it sits on a bedrock of consent from the British people. And as you will know, Chair, we all stood, certainly in our party, on a manifesto commitment last time that we would put in place a robust framework in which the police could adopt and use technology, and that includes, in my view, having an element of democratic consent.
Thank you. Well, let's come on to consider that in more detail, starting with Graham String.
I obviously agree with you, Minister, that we need to get forensics and biometrics right. What puzzles me, I've never met a Home Office Minister, Labour, Tory, Liberal, Coalition, whatever, who doesn't want to lock criminals up and get them away. Having said that, since the decision in December 2010 was taken to sort of wind up the Forensic Science Service, one can only describe the government's response to concerns not just by this committee but by other people as dilatory. Can you give an explanation for that? I mean, not just police taking so long to reply to this committee.
Well, I think to say it's dilatory is probably unfair, but I think it perhaps misses the critical issue, which is that we're not in a position with police forces, for example, in particular, to pull levers and tell them broadly what to do. Obviously, since 2012, we've had police and crime commissioners who effectively act as local authorities governing their local police force, as you know, and police chiefs themselves are operationally independent. And while the Home Office obviously has a role in negotiating outcome and then paying for it, the direct lever that we can pull is not exact. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that policing has not, how can I put this delicately, policing has not been the swiftest of adopters where new technology is concerned, and its ability to harness, whether it's forensic development or indeed develops in biometrics, quickly and in advance of development and predict what's going to happen and create a framework in which it can be adopted, has not, I'm afraid to say, been brilliant in the past. Now, very often acceleration in adoption has come about either through the leadership of particular individuals. Certainly my experience in policing is that if you have a leader in a particular police force that wants something to happen and wants to adopt something, then it will happen, or because of some breakthrough in discovery that advances it. So, for example, the conviction of the killers of Stephen Lawrence came about, 18 or 19 years after that event, largely through advances in forensic techniques, the ability to identify tiny spots of blood and connect them from evidence which had been retained for many years, was a huge advance and led to a significant conviction. Now, that is a moment of revelation to what might be possible that then propels advancement. Having said that, my predecessor, and indeed I hope I, have recognised the need to accelerate reform. There's been significant investment, obviously, as you heard from Dr. Tully, and we're grateful to her for her work about the Forensics Capability Network and the Transforming Forensics Programme, which I think is making some progress, and we've both of us, both my predecessor Nick Hurd and I, tried to ensure that in amongst the myriad other things that chiefs and police and crime commissioners have to deal with, that forensics should be very high on the list for their consideration.
I think if you were on Question Time, Minister, and you blamed police commissioners...
No, not blaming.
Well, just let me finish. Mm-hmm. Police commissioners and chief constables for being slow in dealing with forensics, you would be booed. But let me ask the question the other way round. Why do you think so many police laboratories have consistently failed to meet the deadlines on accreditation, and what have you done to try to incentivise them to meet those deadlines?
Well, as I say, there's a number of things that we've done. I mean, the first thing, obviously, is we've made a significant investment in the Transforming Forensics Programme and the Forensics Capability Network, where we've created or helped to create or supported the creation of a network in policing which is designed to coordinate and to improve and to allow for policing to become a much more intelligent customer, if you like, of the private sector in forensics. So we've done that. And then obviously recently, albeit that we did have a couple of tries legislatively earlier, we have put the regulator on a statutory footing and given powers of intervention which would allow that person to intervene where they felt that something negative was happening that was prejudicing the course of criminal justice, and indeed to forbid an individual or organisation from conducting forensic science activities. So it might have been a bit slow, but I think we're broadly getting there.
When do you think you will have been successful, or the regulator will have been successful in getting all police laboratories accredited?
Well, it depends what you mean by accredited. So obviously there are various activities which are accredited, and there are a number of areas where we've got 100% accreditation now.
Well, that's the most difficult question then. When will it be that 100% of police laboratories have 100% accreditation?
So that is a good question that I can't give you a date on, but I'm hoping as soon as possible.
Well, can you be more precise than that, Minister? As soon as possible, given the Home Office's previous history, could mean anything up to a decade.
Well, it depends which activity you mean. I mean, I've got, so for example, on our DNA recovery labs, everybody is currently accredited. Yeah. But on our digital forensics works, we've got, partial
The question was 100% of laboratories to 100% accreditation.
I'll have to ask Christoph to remind me of when the deadline is. Christoph, when do we think they'll all be accredited?
We can't give a firm time for when all of them will be accredited, Minister, but as you've noted, with the introduction of the Forensic Science Regulator, we hope that will encourage forces to accredit their laboratories, and with the work of the Forensics Capability Network, which is looking and is already working to assist them in doing that faster and in a more consistent manner across forces. We'd hope to see some acceleration in the accreditation of those disciplines across all of the forces.
Thanks.
So, for example, you heard from Dr. Tully that crime scene investigation is currently quite low accreditation, with a deadline looming of October 2022. My hope is that everybody would hit that deadline, and there's significant work going on through the Transforming Forensics, through the Forensics Capability Network, to directly support those organisations to try and accelerate the accreditation. If some don't hit that, then we'll obviously have to work out what we do to ensure that they come up to standard as quickly as possible. But you see, I can't give a firm date, as I say, because I'm not able to mandate to people that they should hit a particular deadline, because I'm not the Police and Crime Commissioner for Manchester, for example. So it's a question which we can address to the Mayor of Manchester and say, when will you, or the Deputy Mayor for Policing, when will you be accredited? But we can't mandate that they have to do it.
Well, in terms of the process of getting there, fingerprints and DNA have a legal requirement to seek accreditation drives to compliance. Why has the government been reluctant to legislate in further areas of forensics so that beyond fingerprints and DNA, so that the police have to seek accreditation in those areas?
Such as?
It's usual that we ask the question.
No. Because there are a variety of areas where we are...
But you've stopped at DNA and fingerprints. There are lots of other areas.
Thank you, Professor Tully, in the earlier session.
Yeah, so what we've rather decided to do, as I say, is to put the regulator on a statutory footing that they can intervene in a particular, if they think that...
But they would be helped by a legislative framework, wouldn't they?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I'm quite happy to review it once we've seen the operation of the new regime and take a view as to whether mandation of all the various... Because part of the problem as well is as new technologies, as new techniques come on, we would probably then have to have mandation for those as well, I guess, would we? Such is the moving field of science in this area that it's quite hard to have specific mandations other than very established services. We rather thought it was better, and that's why we supported the bill, to have a situation where you've got a regulator who's able to say, look, this isn't up to scratch. You either get up to scratch sharpish, or I'm going to stop you doing it. And that would be a better incentive than having a sort of arbitrary and possibly movable feast on mandation.
Thank you.
So just to pursue this a little, I mean, Mr. Malthouse, you mentioned that the police have been quite slow in adopting some of the cutting-edge technologies, and that's quite a reproof for a country that is so capable in branches of science and technology, including this one. We're making discoveries that are exported around the world. The government, quite rightly, has made a great feature of this in the integrated review, of which security is an important aspect. We're promoting our ability to do this. So it's shaming that our police forces should be slow in not just adopting the technology, but actually coming to a reliable, accredited ability to deploy it, is it not?
Well, there's the absolute and the relative. I mean, I think we're still relatively very good, and certainly if you look at the turnaround time and data from European laboratories, we do extremely well and beat them on certainly on some of their deadlines. But we set ourselves very high standards, as you rightly say. We are leaders in this field, and we want everybody to get up to standard as quickly as possible, and that is why we've supported putting the regulator on a statutory footing. Obviously, we tried the non-statutory route, and it felt as if progress was not as fast as we would have liked. And to be fair to the police, in particular, they felt the same way. The leadership of the Forensic Capability Network has been extremely active and assertive and been out there doing their thing. But this step we felt was required to try and encourage, shall we say, further compliance and progress.
But Professor Tully was very clear that gaining accreditation wasn't simply a matter of kind of ticking a box. It wasn't just a bureaucratic thing. That actually it established whether the organisation, whether the lab was capable or not. And that has real consequences when it comes to actually the security of convictions, or perhaps, as you said, even more so, the ability to secure a conviction. So encouragement seems to be a bit minimal in terms of something so important. Are you frustrated that you don't, and I understand that you don't, but are you frustrated that you don't have the power to direct the forces to comply?
Well, I think every senior politician is, not that I am senior, but every politician is frustrated that they don't have world domination and the ability to order and point and say, do this and do that. Look, I mean, I think there are a variety of incentives in the system for these organisations to get it right. And you are right that there is fundamentally a consequence in court in front of a judge, where obviously accreditation or otherwise can be examined, and that therefore the veracity or otherwise of the evidence that's being adduced in court can be weighed in the balance, and that will have an impact. I agree, and that's why we're trying to encourage accreditation as quickly as possible. But as you will know from your days as a councillor, where there is a diffuse organisation of operationally independent police forces that have an elected individual who's in charge of them, that often encouragement around an incentive structure that both has now the ability to intervene but also a result at the end of it in court will probably make more progress than necessarily as just ordering that something should be done.
If that works, but if it's not working and not working quickly enough, then one has to look for solutions. And you may have heard the evidence from Professor Tully about the decision-making process not being aligned with the advice that was coming out. I mean, given what you've described from someone very experienced of this, do you not take away the need to look at the mismatch between the decision-making process and the advice that is being given?
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, obviously this is, as I said right at the start, this is an area of significant importance and concern for us, both on forensics and on biometrics, because it's central to the success of the mission into the future, and we're constantly reviewing those kind of interactions. My view at the moment is I would like to see how the new regulator intervenes. I think that when the first compliance notice is issued, that will have an impact culturally, that will send a message, and I hope that and I know that the urgency of getting this right is impressed upon policing in its widest sense, not least because, as you say, the impact is felt out on the front line in court and elsewhere, and I hope that we'll see significant improvement shortly.
What do you have to say about Professor Tully's evidence that in the fields of digital forensics and toxicology there is insufficient current capacity?
Well, digital forensics, I'm not sure it's necessarily capacity as opposed to capability. So for example, I think the software is there, all the rest of it, the ability to train is there, and there's some forces that are doing it better than others. So for example, as part of our work on the rape review, we've given a commitment that in a fairly short period, nobody will have to give up their phone for less than 24 hours, and for more than 24 hours, sorry, and that we want to compress the time between report and a file going to the CPS. That will naturally require us using software to interrogate, to do the digital forensics work that's required for disclosure and investigation on both the perpetrator and accuser's phone. That capability is there, and there are forces that are doing it already, and certainly as part of the implementation of the new AG's disclosure guidelines on forces, the adoption of that. I was in Thames Valley just the other week. The adoption of those new techniques, that new training, that is all being rolled out. So the capability is there rather than so the capability is what's required rather than the capacity. On toxicology, I am a bit concerned about capacity, if the truth be told, not least because somebody mentioned to me, I forget, that there are something like only 20 forensic toxicologists in the whole country. So notwithstanding us wanting to access more capacity, our ability to have those expert individuals at our disposal is somewhat limited. Please God, they don't all go off on holiday at the same time or to a conference somewhere on the same time. And so it's certainly one of the lessons that's coming out for me is us looking at the specific individual capacity that we require as a science base and seeing what we can do to stimulate more people to join.
Well, I mean, that's right, isn't it? We shouldn't be relying on the Almighty to save us from this. There are situations in which things that are decentralised. If there's a problem, then ultimately the buck stops with ministers to intervene and correct what might be an exception. So you're prepared to do that?
Oh, I'm certainly want to have a think about what we can do to stimulate more forensic toxicologists to join that profession. Absolutely. I mean, there was a sort of mythology, I think, that after the years of CSI and all the rest of it on TV, that there were thousands of young people going off to do forensics course at university, but it doesn't seem as if many of them have gone into the toxicology field. Certainly what I was told, but I will be having an urgent look at that and thinking about what we can do to stimulate more, perhaps, to join that profession.
Thank you. I'll turn to Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. Just touching on accreditation again. I mean, obviously, we want to get as many organisations accredited as possible, but two organisations can hold the same ISO accreditation, but in very different scopes. Are you at all concerned that having the same standard of accreditation can mean something wildly different from one organisation to the next?
Well, to be fair, I'm not technically skilled enough to judge between whether two applications for a similar ISO will have a different application. But as I say, I would be concerned about a lack of consistency across policing. And what I hope is that us having a statutory regulator will enable us to make sure that all those forces are, when they are accredited, that the accreditation means what it says on the tin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just on accreditation and the regulator, obviously the regulator can blow the whistle, can draw attention to areas of poor practice. But will you address the question that came up as to why you think the power to demand accreditation would diminish the independence of the regulator?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, obviously we are urging accreditation and encouraging accreditation and investing in a network to get police forces to accredit. And I guess to a certain extent that there is by default the power to demand, so that if the regulator decides through the bill that a particular operation of a particular activity is deleterious to the operation of the criminal justice system, they can issue a prohibition notice that they can't continue. Now that may be that they can't continue in the absence of accreditation. So there's a sort of de facto power there to propel improvement and to get towards accreditation.
So in your view, that it would be open to the regulator to require accreditation as an alternative to issuing a prohibition.
Well, you would expect, wouldn't you, that any sensible regulator would be in discussion with the force about the operation of a forensic science activity that they felt was negatively impacting or not going well, and that they're able to say, well, I may be issuing a prohibition notice unless and until you do X, Y, Z. And one would hope that there'd be a kind of an agreed improvement programme that might include achieving accreditation.
Okay. Aaron Bell.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ministers, for coming in. I want to go back to custody images. I think you heard some of the evidence at the end of the last session with Professor Wiles. I don't mind who answers, but I know Baroness Williams has answered the committee on this a lot in the past. In a letter to the chair of the committee, dated the 21st of June, the Ada Lovelace Institute, who specialise in data and artificial intelligence, stated that their research had found that, quote, the extensive retention of custody images for retroactive use in biometric systems did not meet public expectations for proportionality or consent. Is that a position the government shares?
Well, if I could say at this point, we thank the Ada Lovelace Institution for the work that we've done, and obviously we take their reports very seriously. I think it's important in terms of retention of custody images that although we can't automatically delete them, that the police have got an obligation, and in fact they have just finished and have now got out the guidance on the police's obligations, that if there will be a presumption of deletion unless there are specific reasons why an image shouldn't be deleted. That could be in the areas either serious crime or indeed for terrorism reasons. So there is a presumption to delete, and it's been mentioned earlier that obviously there is an automated deletion at this point. But the police are now putting out that information, as I say, both on gov.uk and in custody suites as well, so that people know what their rights are in regards to deletion.
And you said there is a presumption to delete as well. Is that at the 6-year point, or is that earlier?
Or actually, if someone hasn't been convicted, I mean, you could go to the police the week after you have been questioned but not charged but not convicted, and say, delete my image.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you mentioned that, well, the government has repeatedly claimed that it's too complex to weed out the old custody images manually. Could you just explain what that complexity is?
Well, if you think that we have got something like 18, I think it's 18.3 million custody images, that's an awful lot of custody images for the police to manually trawl through. But what they have got an obligation to do is to both review their custody images, and when someone requests deletion, there is that presumption to delete. And that is why when we are able to, or when the police are able to automatically delete, we will be in a much better place.
And so is that I mean, I was going to ask what the alternative you're offering to comply with the High Court ruling in R versus MPS from 2012, that the indefinite retention is unlawful. Is the alternative that when we get to the law enforcement data service, that will address those concerns?
Well, there's sort of two alternatives. The alternative is that when someone requests deletion, that there is that presumption to delete, and then there is the ambition which we have, which is to ensure that the new systems, and through the police obviously, enable that automatic deletion.
And I mean, you've already referenced this, but the Information Commissioner's Office has highlighted the seeming lack of awareness of unconvicted individuals of the right to request deletion. You've said there's some better practice now. Is that uniform across the country?
It probably isn't, because none of these things are uniform across the country, but certainly we now have a lead for science in I'm just trying to remember who the chief is. Paul Taylor is our lead for science, and we've also got two groups that the NPCC lead on, and one is the AFR board and the other is the Biometrics Strategy Board. So there is much more I would say there's a definite focus from the police on their obligations in this area. And of course, technology is evolving. It's getting more complex. And I think it was Graham was talking about gait analysis. You know, there are so many different now biometrics that I think that legal framework for their use, retention and deletion is becoming more important.
Yeah, understood. When you were in front of the predecessor committee in 2019, you said that there was an updated custody images review in progress then, which was expected to conclude in 2020. I think we'd all understand if there'd been some slippage on that because of coronavirus, but can we expect to see conclusions imminently?
Well, what we expect the police to do is to review their custody images regularly. So it's not a kind of, it happens once and then we look at it 6 years later. We do expect this to be an ongoing process. And as I say, it will be a good day when we can automatically do it without people having to ask us.
But is there a formal custody image review, that's going to be presented to Parliament? You're nodding, Mr. Moldhouse.
No, sorry, not necessarily to Parliament, but there is a formal review period for custody images, which police forces should be enacting in line with MOPI, as you heard earlier, and only retaining those images which they're supposed to keep.
And then so has an assessment therefore been carried out to evaluate whether the findings from the previous custody image review in 2017 complies with all our other legislation around data protection? Has that assessment been made?
I don't know I'm not sure if an assessment has been made, but certainly in order to comply, if someone does request deletion and there is no reason to keep that image, then it should be deleted. But obviously in a perfect world, the image will be auto-deleted. And we hope to do that by the end of this Parliament.
Thank you. And sort of finally, to widen it out a bit more, because Professor Wiles did as well, does the government intend to produce more widespread legislation to keep pace with developments in biometric technology, not just in terms of fighting crime and all the rest of it, but in terms of the sort of things we heard about the commercial uses and so on? Is that something that's it'll be a Home Office remit, obviously, even if it's not directly about fighting or preventing crime?
Yeah, as I said in my the opening, we do have a manifesto commitment to create a legal framework. Obviously there is a framework at the moment, and that's been adduced through the courts. But as technology advances, I think we would like to get to a position where both the police and the public can be confident about the legislative architecture that enables the adoption of future technology. Now, whether that is required through legislation or not is a matter for discussion. But as I say, we've got a manifesto commitment, so no doubt we'll be bringing forward plans before the next election.
Yes, are you able to be any more precise about the timescales for that? I mean, sorry, Baron.
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, it's interesting to compare the comments of our new Biometrics Commissioner, stroke Surveillance Camera Commissioner, with the comments of Paul Wiles, because our new Commissioner, and I really am in tune with his comments, said that, and I said this earlier on, biometric technology is changing all the time. So it is not the individual technology that we need to hone in on. It is actually the legal framework that allows the police use that is both necessary and proportionate, and that has public trust. And actually, if we can get that right, that is where I will feel satisfied. There may be legislation in the future that we haven't thought about that needs to come in, but I think that is the central point. Because if gait analysis this time next year is suddenly the thing that is suddenly the thing that the police feel is a really valuable tool, then that framework is in place.
Thank you. So, are there any timescales as to when we might expect a bill or a white paper?
I can't give you a timescale other than, as I say, we had a manifesto commitment, so we would imagine that plans would be outlined before the next election. And I think, to be honest with you, we could already start to feel a growing call from the House of Commons for some of this stuff to come for democratic consent. Now, whether that's through the Westminster Hall debates or the backbench debates, or as this technology starts to advance and be used by the police, I think it would be desirable for there to be an element of democratic consent around it, and that's certainly, I think, where our manifesto commitment was aimed. And we do need to take care about the use of this in inspiring confidence in people. I'm happen to be married to a Canadian, and when the Canadians introduced fixed speed cameras on roads, there was such a clamour from the population that they thought this was so unfair and not sort of fair play, that after 2 or 3 years, I think they were all removed, and so they don't have those fixed cameras because they hadn't established that element of public consent for the use of them. So I do think we need to think about that, and no doubt plans will be forthcoming.
And just finally, to sort of take it, look at it from the other angle, that people would expect that we keep custody images or facial recognition images of people of real ongoing concern. How confident are we of our legal position in those cases where they may be unconvicted, they may never have even been charged? How confident are we of the legal position of retaining those images of and data and biometric data of interest?
I mean, if I could answer that, I think it goes back to that fundamental point that the police have to assure themselves that they are using images for policing purposes. It's necessary, it's proportionate, and actually some of those images will be for people wanted of some pretty serious crimes, but not yet convicted.
Yes.
But they have to have that rationale around the list.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just to pick up on something that Erin said, so the custody image review, when you appeared before the predecessor committee in 2019, you said that it would be completed by 2020, but it hasn't been published yet. Do you know when it will be published?
I can find that out for you, Chairman.
But will it be published?
I'm assuming if I said it would, it will.
I'm assuming so too.
But I can clarify that. Right. I don't know if Christoph has got. Actually, he might be able to.
Dr. Prince.
We are continuing to work with police and colleagues around ensuring that the rules we have from the custody image review of 2017 stay relevant and to date, and we're confident that they meet the legal frameworks we have at the moment. But as the Minister has said, one of the key questions is our ability to support automatic review and automated deletion going forward.
That wasn't the question. The question was whether you completed the review that Baroness Williams promised by 2020. Has that been completed?
There is not a completed review that we would provide to ministers at this stage.
Why not?
Because the work is ongoing, and in particular with the developments in the Bridges case and other developments, we've not been in a position to complete that work.
So it was promised in 2019 that it would be ready in 2020. It's now last day of June 2021. When might we expect it?
I would that would be in discussion with ministers.
Broadly, in the next month or the next 3 months?
Chair, we're continuing the work in light of the developments that are currently underway, and I'm not in a position to give a commitment to you at this stage.
Mr. Malthouse.
I think, to be fair, probably we need to go away and discuss a possible timescale, and then we'll write to you with our.
I think if I may say that if a commitment is given in 2019 that's something that will be provided in 2020, then to come back in 2021 and have only the kind of vaguer sense as to where this is not really, I think, not in line with what we would expect. I'm sure if there are reasons why it hasn't been completed, and I'm sure there are, that is fine.
Yeah.
But a commitment is a commitment and can't simply be dropped and replaced by a set of sort of vague references.
I mean. Sorry, Kit,
no, go ahead.
I think it's probably fair to say, A, we're in a new Parliament, B, we've had the Bridges judgment, appeal judgment, but I would request that perhaps we could go away and clarify that for you, Chairman.
Absolutely. Graham Stringer wanted to come back in.
I never thought I'd say this to one or even two ministers that we've got before, but where there's quickly moving technology or information, or indeed changing behaviour by the population, it's normal for governments to take Henry VIII power and use statutory instruments to deal with it. So although there is a quickly changing situation, that you can have clarity in terms of the government's intentions towards regulation and for the courts to deal with. I never thought I'd ask this, but why haven't the government taken Henry VIII powers in these areas? That's the easiest question ever be asked.
That is a very good suggestion. I hope that if it appears, Mr. Stringer, that you will speak heavily in favour of that particular legislation. I understand what you're saying, and the fact that having a framework which would then allow us to adopt that stuff and do it through possibly secondary legislation as it comes might be a route. But at the same time, that is quite cumbersome and slow, and may end up with us producing lots of SIs for example, pilot use of particular technology, which then ends up being a dead end. Much rather that we'd have a go at having a general framework that provides consent and approval, rather than bother you with SIs every couple of weeks when somebody has a smart idea at a particular surveillance technology. So for example, just to give you another story, I went to the Home Office holds a security conference, or did before COVID, every year at Farnborough, where lots of companies come to display their technology in policing to an international audience. It's a vast, great hall, and it's filled with stands with people with lots and lots of technology which may or may not alarm, but nevertheless is dedicated to making the police more effective at doing their job. And some of it, we'd love to have a go at. As you know, as part of the Transforming Forensics Capability Network, there is a kind of R&D function that we're looking at, is what is coming down the track and what should we be pursuing. But for us to have endless SIs, for us to have a look at that stuff, might seem a little cumbersome. But I'll have a think about it if you're offering.
Well, it's an idea, because certainty and legislation can be helpful in both directions. And for a government that's put through 550 SIs, is it, over the last 12 months on one area of health, which shouldn't be impossible.
No, I agree with you. And to be honest with you, I think there might be some value in that, not, as I say, because things are changing so quickly. But if we could get an overall framework, I think it might be better. So, for example, just in the last 10 or 12 years, the smartphone, the reason it's called an iPhone 12 is because the iPhone is only 12 years old, right? And the development of the technology of that particular device over those 12 years has been extraordinary. And each iteration of it and its competitors produces a new technology. So, for example, one of the things of the latest iterations of phones, which has sadly we've seen in a couple of cases, not least that case in Greece, has been the monitoring of effectively biometrics, the functioning of a body, which allows you to pinpoint the moment of death. In the event of a murder, from the data on the phone. Now, that wasn't available, even 2 or 3 years ago, and is now. Now, the police ability to adopt these and use these technologies and adduce them as evidence seems to change with every iteration of a new phone, and so it might get a little complicated, but we'll definitely think about it.
Thank you. Just to return to some of the themes that we've heard during this session, Professor Wiles talked about a complete discretion on the part of chief police officers in considering requests for the deletion of custody images. Do you recognise that description? Is it one that you would agree with?
They don't have a complete discretion in terms of if a member of the public comes and requests deletion because there is no reason for that custody image to be there, they do have to delete it.
But who determines whether they delete it?
Well, if you've not been convicted, if your image is on the if your image is there and there is no policing reason for it to be on, I mean, it's different if there's kind of an ongoing investigation into you, but if there is no reason, no policing reason or criminal justice reason for your image to be there, it should be deleted.
But I think I assume that Professor Wiles is referring to that policing reason, and that is in the sole judgment of the Chief Constable, is it not? Which, you know, is potentially subject to, well, at the very least, opacity and possibly some injustices in the sense of being more cautious than might be in the interests of the individual.
I mean, I think it's very the guidance is very clear on deletion. I don't know if Christoph, you want to say anything more about that, but I don't think there's much wriggle room in terms of deletion of custody image.
Dr. Prince?
So chiefs have that discretion, but they are required to have an exceptional reason to retain it, and where it's for an under 18-year-old to have a highly exceptional reason to do that, that is a discretion that falls to them as they have discretion in other areas, but they do in that. But only for exceptional reasons or highly exceptional in the case of under 18-year-olds.
Yeah, the discretion is quite tightly defined.
Well, it's tightly defined as being exceptional, but is it rigorously scrutinised to see that it genuinely is? How do we know that obviously intention that it should be literally exceptional is in practice not being interpreted more loosely by certain chief constables? How do we guard against that?
I think that's a good question, and I don't know, Christoph.
Does the policing minister?
No, well, I mean, obviously, while chief constables do have a lot of power and discretion, it is testable, I guess, through a number of routes. You as a constituency MP will have had correspondence, I've no doubt, from constituents who are complaining about the discretion of chief constables. There's obviously a complaints mechanism which can be pursued by individuals, as well as appealing to the local police and crime commissioner, all of whom can at least request re-examination of the case for retention. But in the end, very often we find in situations where police forces use their discretion, it's a judicial decision.
I mean, reflecting on what we've heard, and as both ministers have said, the technology is developing very rapidly indeed, and therefore obviously practice and to a certain extent regulation has to keep pace with that. You might have heard me put to Professor Wiles in the last session that the use of live facial recognition can be quite important in preventing current terrorist attacks, and therefore this might need to be weighed in the balance. So I guess what's kind of coming out of this is that these are important issues that perhaps haven't had the degree of parliamentary consideration that they merit. And it's not to say that the resolution of this will be on one side or the other. Do you think there is a case for a piece of legislation that could consider the right way forward with the combining the safeguards for civil liberties against the protection that we owe to our fellow citizens?
I mean, the legal framework that was confirmed in the Bridges appeal said that there were a combination of four things which confirmed the legal grounds on which to use this. There was common law powers, data protection, equality and human rights legislation, and surveillance camera code. Nevertheless, I think what you're asking is slightly different, which is there further work to do to scrutinise whether what we have in place is sufficient? And of course the answer is yes, because these technologies are evolving all the time.
And we're doing this in the online world, as the Online Harms Bill. There's a lot of parliamentary attention to this, as Minister Moulton said, citing the example of Canada. Things work best when actually regulations and practice are in tune with public opinion, or at least public opinion has been has been engaged in the development of regulations. So this might be an area. And that might perhaps address something that the Information Commissioner said earlier this month. She said that she was deeply concerned about the potential for live facial recognition technology to be used inappropriately, excessively, or even recklessly. How do you intend to respond to her concerns? Obviously, the Information Commissioner is a serious person in this field.
Yeah, I mean, she's right. It has got to be used in a necessary, proportionate way as far as the police are concerned, and in a way that's got public trust. So I think we need to always check ourselves that is precisely that we as the Home Office and they as the police are doing.
And when she says she's deeply concerned, I mean, that sort of flags that I think she expects, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but that she thinks that more needs to be done to address these concerns. And again, she's not saying one way or the other what the resolution is. I think she's referring to the potential for harm.
Yeah, I mean, she may have been referring also to the commercial use of it, which I'm not batting it over to another department, but that's kind of something that DCMS lead on. But I think that to always be checking ourselves that we have that principles-based approach in its use is the right way to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think just to add, to be fair to the police in the relatively limited use thus far, they are also very sensitive to that issue. So if you look, for example, at the Met Police deployment of LFR, their system, if you like, for deployment and then scrutiny was fairly elaborate to allow the proper, well, A, assessment of it, but B, transparency around how, where, and when it was going to be used, sort of post-match scrutiny of it being used by non-Met people, all that kind of stuff. And I think that was certainly talking to Assistant Commissioner Nick F. Grave, who ran that programme, and they were very, very sensitive to the notion that if this wasn't used correctly, that it had the potential to undermine public trust generally in the use of technology. And thus far, it seems to have been relatively successful. I think there were 8 arrests for some quite serious offences. But obviously they advertise geographically where it's being used. But we do know that it has a big psychological impact as well. And there's the famous story about the use at a pop concert, a rock concert. There's a particular band that had a particular problem with dippers and pickpockets, whatever, phones, hundreds of phones being stolen. The advertising at one of their concerts of the fact that facial recognition was being used at the concert, they put lots of notices up, meant that the number of offences dropped to 0 at that particular conference. So it can have a powerful deterrent effect in those kind of public order situations. You could see why a private sector organisation wanting to enhance its safety would be interested in that kind of technology.
Indeed, and you can be confident that members of the Science and Technology Committee are not anti-technology. We're concerned that we can make the best of it. Catherine Fletcher wanted to come in before we conclude.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ministers, and thank you, Dr. Prince. In the previous session, we started to touch on some of the concerns about the increasing globalised nature of technology, and that other states use these technologies, biometrics, facial recognition, for purposes that perhaps don't sit well within a democracy. And lots of people are kind of concerned about that. So I wondered, in the process of these discussions, not only the rules and the parameters by which decisions are made within the UK police force, are you confident that the technology isn't leaking out the back into other states? So what I'm getting at is the database of the photos held in the UK, are those servers backed up in other places? Is that an aspect that the British people can move forward confidently with? That it's a British debate on British data, or are we subject to the dissemination of data across the globe? I don't know who to ask that to, I'm very sorry.
Who wants to? Baroness Williams.
Yeah, I'll have a go at it. I mean, it's a very good point. I think, just reflect on the fact we're very lucky in the democracy in which we live, whether it's CCTV or whether it's another technology for policing purpose. The clarity around that is very sound. In terms of whether that data then leaks to other states with malign intent, we do put systems and processes in place to ensure that that does not happen.
I guess the question was, though, is the physical data bank in the UK, on UK territory, was the question, I think, and it is, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
So no, that's fine. So it's not sitting in an Amazon data farm in the forests of Nevada or indeed in France. It's all UK based.
Yeah, because what's very striking is that application of AI, where others, have made significant advancements, and a decent database that's not from the 1970s and coded in Fortran, has implications for where you walk in front of a CCTV camera in this country. So that's great to hear. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Just finally from me, a couple of questions. Does the government, perhaps to Baroness Williams, does the government intend to issue guidance on the watch list compilation for automatic facial recognition? Because obviously there are two sides to the equation. You detect people's images, but then they have to be checked against a watch list. Are you going to issue guidance on that?
So in terms of guidance, there's NPCC guidance that is going to be national guidance. In terms of the police issuing guidance, I'm not sure. Kit, do you know the answer?
I don't know. We'll have to come back to you, I would imagine. So, I mean, it's quite a difficult one to issue guidance on, other than, obviously, the image that's being used is already held properly for a policing purpose. I don't know, though, whether the lists use... Christoph may be able to advise us, but what the particular techniques of putting people on a watch list are. But...
So, Dr. Prince?
If I may. So the College of Policing have just closed a consultation on national guidance in respect of live facial recognition, which contains guidance on the selection of images for watch lists, and that has just been consulted on. So there is guidance in preparation.
So that will come out shortly, because there's no particular reason why the compilation of a watch list should be different in Kent than it is in Hampshire or Greater Manchester. Thank you. Catherine mentioned Fortran, which takes us back to remarks that were made about the police national computer and the fact that we are relying on technology that, at least in some components, goes back to the 1970s. Perhaps, Skip Malthouse, when is the police national computer going to be replaced?
Well, as you know, we're in the middle of a fairly large programme to replace it, and we are, I think it's fair to say, going through a reset of that particular programme at the moment. We've got a couple of our communications programme and this programme, two big delivery programmes, and we're resetting at the moment, and we're hoping that it'll be delivered by, I think, is it 2020, Susan, 2020?
End of this
Parliament. But that, who knows when the Prime Minister may or may not call the election. But I think the idea is that it's by the autumn of 2024.
Autumn 24. And just finally, to end on one of the themes that we've mentioned briefly, lots of opportunities, lots of potential for the deployment of technology to keep people safer here. We are a leading science and technological nation. We know through the integrated review that the government does have an ambition to do even better on this. What part is the Home Office going to play in this?
Well, we are very keen to, as I said earlier, to harness and stimulate the use of science and technology in policing and indeed in the wider operation of the Home Office. One of the things that we did commit to as part of our, in the manifesto as well, was the creation of a National Criminal Justice Laboratory. And one of the things that I hope when it is established that it will turn its mind to is exactly that, is the research and development, the prediction of technology that's coming and its adoption. At the moment, we have a slightly odd access point for new technology, particularly into policing, which is where if somebody has a technique or a gizmo or a gadget, whatever it might be, they need to find a sponsoring organisation, a police force that wants it looked at before it will be put through the assessment process and all the rest of it. So that means that unless you can find somebody who's interested in policing to sponsor the acquisition of the technology, it doesn't really go anywhere. Now that I'm not sure is ideal or giving us enough of a scope of the horizon to adopt new technology that's coming along. And the idea behind the Criminal Justice Laboratory, as well as doing lots of work on data and all that kind of stuff, was that it would do some of that work to scan what's available, decide what we need, what's looking good, and then stimulate or invest in it.
Okay. Well, we'd be very interested in following this up and keeping pace with the developments that you're responsible for there. Very interesting session, lots of things coming out for both the future of regulation and the deployment of technology, but also in terms of going back to this point of accreditation. The word encouragement has been used in terms of the means at your disposal to get good practice. My experience of working with